you for coming. This afternoon I'm going to talk about the political economy of Arab Spring. This is based on an article which I wrote just after the uprisings started initially, that at the moment I'm trying to expand it. On 17 December 2010, a 26-year-old man named Mohammed Bouaziz poured petrol over himself and set his own body alight in front of the office of the regional governor of a small town in Tunisia, where 50% of young people were unemployed. This incident came after the police had smashed his fruit cart, his only means of survival, despite his university degree with an MBA from an elite Tunisian university. In the aftermath of this incident, life turned upside down in Tunisia, and the fire that Bouaziz lit burned until it engulfed the whole country, from town to town, even to the small villages. He died an agonizing death from his injuries after 3 weeks in the hospital. And all this triggered protests which led to the downfall of the president Abidine Ben Ali. Soon protests spread to Egypt, Yemen, Libya, and other parts of the Arabic North Africa and the Middle East and some Gulf countries. Bouaziz's plight echoed the helpless fate of so many thousands and thousands of young Tunisians, Egyptians, Libyans, Syrians, and other unemployed youth in the Middle East and North Africa, all seduced by the promises of higher education, yet frustrated and thwarted by the visionless, unproductive, corrupt power elites of Western-friendly regimes. The uprisings have come from a complex mix of socio-economic problems involving the sharp rise in food prices, high youth unemployment, together with a widespread hatred of corrupt regimes. All these factors have combined in different ways in various countries, leading to a strong popular unrest. The Western media has focused on, mainly, the abuses of political rights and the suppression of civil society, in isolation from an analysis of how the agenda of global economic integration of the region into world economy and how much suffering and vulnerability this created for the societies. Of course, we cannot deny the fact that people in one country have drawn and will continue to draw inspiration and strength from the mass protest movements in others. The partial successes in Tunisia and Egypt detonated similar movements elsewhere, but they did so only in countries with similar historical legacy, the same sharp socio-economic polarities between rentier rulers and marginal street labor. And also where the autocratic rulers were deeply integrated and subordinated to global economic interests and military networks. As many analysts have pointed out, an overwhelming motivation of the people who took the streets with the Arab Spring was the dismal economic and employment conditions on the ground, high unemployment among the young people, and chronic capitalism, inefficient welfare state, and food shortages in most of these places. What has been less adequately reported is that Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Syria, Morocco, and Jordan all experienced an intense economic transformation during the past couple of decades, away from Arab socialism of the 1960s and 70s and towards neoliberal capitalism in the 1980s and 90s. Through the guidance and assistance of the IMF and the World Bank, the MENA region, Middle East and North Africa, pursued neoliberal economic policies, entrepreneurial freedom, strong property rights, free markets and free trade, and all which led to great income inequalities and a concentration of wealth among the political elite and its cronies. The region has been witnessing an unprecedented demographic transition, resulting in one of the largest youth cohorts in its history. This is the young generation in waiting, a generation waiting for jobs and justice. The recent uprisings were fueled by poverty, unemployment, and lack of opportunities for these young people. Over the last 2 decades, the region witnessed an unprecedented population growth. And this has dramatically changed the demographic profile of the whole region. A significant proportion of its working age population now consisting of young people in the age bracket of 15 to 24. During the 1996 to 2006, during those 10 years, labor force in the Middle East and North Africa has grown 3 times as much annually as in the rest of the developing world, resulting in one of the largest rates of youth unemployment globally. Youth unemployment is over 30% everywhere in the region, and in Syria and Jordan in particular, young people under the age of 30 constitute more than 70% of the unemployed workforce. Over time, the population in the Middle East and North Africa has not only grown younger, it has also become more educated. There was a resounding success in expanding access to and closing gender gaps in education in the region. Of the top 10 countries that made the most impressive development in human progress, human development, during the last 40 years, were from this region, according to United Nations Development Program, UNDP. Starting from one of the lowest levels of educational achievement in the 1960s, adult education rose faster in this region during 1980 to 2000 than any other region in the world. Other emerging market economies, like the ones in Southeast Asia or Latin America, have successfully harnessed their young population for development. In the MENA region, however, there is a vivid mismatch between demography and economic structure. While demography is evolving, the economic structure is unresponsive to the needs of growing young population. And the last 2 decades, neoliberal policies have made the situation worse, rather than providing practical solutions. Most of the MENA economies where the revolts took place and still are taking place are structured strictly on rents from oil, gas, minerals, and tourism, which provide most of the export earnings and state revenues. These sectors are export enclaves employing a tiny fraction of the labor force, defining a highly specialized economy. They have no links to a diversified domestic economy because all finished manufactured goods, as well as all financial and high-tech services, are imported and controlled by multinational companies. The most obvious common feature of the principal storm centers so far, Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and Syria, is a far-reaching program of neoliberal restructuring, which has been directed by the IMF and the World Bank for the last 2 decades. And these policies put into practice by the regimes with similar devastating results. These include sharp privatization, mass poverty, growing youth unemployment, the lack of opportunities for university and college graduates, falling real wages, and the accumulation of vast amounts of wealth in the hands of countries' top ruling families and their cronies. World Bank and IMF prescribed extensive neoliberal policies for Egypt, for instance, since 1991. More than a decade and a half, neoliberal reforms in Egypt has brought the Egyptian society on the brink of a deep social crisis. In line with the Economic Reform and Structural Adjustment Program signed with the International Monetary Fund in 1991, the Egyptian government has been steadily privatizing the public sector, liberalizing prices and rents. By 2005, the government, either wholly or in part, had sold off 209 of 310 public sector companies for privatization. The sale of the public sector has been accompanied by massive layoffs, an end to job security, and a downward spiral of wages and benefits for Egyptian workers. Female workers particularly have become the victim of unemployment as previously public firms became privatized. For Egyptian big business interests, business has boomed and growth has remained positive. And that's why IMF and World Bank continuously praise the Egyptian government for its business and economic reforms. When food prices began hiking, while wages remained stagnant, the economists and the ruling elite in Egypt have been celebrating the positive growth rate of the economy at least for 10 years. This deterioration of workers' lives has corresponded to a rise in labor unrest since 2005. World Bank reports show that currently more than 40% of the Egyptian population, it is almost 40 million people, live in poverty. Egypt's economy has been ruined largely by a combination of self-destructive policies of its own regime, plus neoliberal policies directed and advised by the global financial bodies. The country's economy has suffered disastrously during the last 20 years in terms of the actual the results they achieved. But in terms of the business elite, they accumulated a significantly large amount of wealth. In the 1990s, mid-1990s, the authorities were forced to cut food subsidies and restructure the economy from service sectors, from agricultural and industrial sectors to service sectors and tourism. A large amount of land previously used for producing agricultural products were taken and closed to agriculture and sold or rented to global multinational tourism companies like Thomson's. As a result, since the year 2000, Egypt has suffered many food riots, as the country, once self-sufficient in food, has now become dependent on food imports, mainly from the United States. A large section of the desert farmland now has been used tourist hotels and other accommodations. And these were controlled only by a very small elite and foreign companies. As a result, the country's economy is no longer geared towards Egypt's natural strengths in agriculture and manufacturing, but service sector, especially tourism, has become the main economic activity. But Egyptian government and its reforms were applauded in Washington and by the World Bank, by the IMF and other US officials. Egypt was even given the Top Reformer Award in 2010 by the IMF. The IMF country report on Egypt, published in April 2010, is a clear indication to how firmly the country's economy has been directed by the international finance. It praised tight fiscal and monetary responses imposed in the aftermath of 2008 global financial crisis, with the objective of reducing the fiscal deficit. Following that, inflation had risen beyond 15% in recent months, creating extreme difficulties for millions of Egyptians. But the report claimed that despite all these social unrest, the country's economy is doing really well, and their near-term macroeconomic outlook appears extremely favorable. Tunisia's economic process followed exactly the same route. Again, it was a direct result of its increasingly neoliberal policy towards foreign speculators. Of the 5 countries covered by the World Bank in the region, Tunisia had the fewest limits on the foreign investment, allowing for an unprecedented level of free trade. As a result, Tunisia became the poster child of the Washington Consensus. Not surprisingly, those foreign companies, multinationals, achieved huge amount of profit in their operations in Tunisia. And a large number of banks, hedge funds, or private equity funds increased their share in the Tunisian economy. But at the same time, on the other hand, organized labor was fiercely suppressed. The public education and healthcare systems were gutted by a combination of neglect and privatization. Much of the population suffered stagnant or falling wages relative to inflation. In September 2010, IMF recommended to the Tunisian government the removal of the remaining subsidies as a means of achieving complete fiscal balance. In September 2010, IMF Survey magazine praised Tunisian President Ben Ali for his commitment, I quote, to reduce tax rates on businesses and to offset those reductions by increasing the standard value-added tax, VAT. Mohamed Bouaziz wasn't that guy who burned himself. Mohamed Bouaziz was an informal street trader, and the police overturned his fruit cart a few weeks later on December 27, presumably because he was not contributing to value-added tax with his survivalist business. In the same year, the World Bank stated that, I quote, during the financial crisis of 2008 and 9, the MENA region was actually one of the best performing regions in the world, Middle East and North Africa. So, until almost the beginning of the uprisings, the neoliberal economic policies adopted by the rulers in this region were hailed as prudent and wise by the international financial institutions, as well as the official government spokespeople in the United States and mainly in France. As a result, the sudden surge in food prices opened a new phase of the process of widespread impoverishment in all these countries. The same neoliberal pro-dictator narrative was established in Libya. In the IMF's October 2010 pronouncements, in which Muammar Gaddafi's mass firing of almost 400,000 civil servants was celebrated. I quote, about a quarter of these people have reportedly found other sources of income and are no longer receiving transfers from the state budget. The mission recommends that the retrenchment program be accelerated. The IMF's last full article consultation for Libya was published on February 15, 2011, just 1 week before the uprising broke out in Libya. Implying that Gaddafi was safe from the Arab Spring, the IMF noted that, I quote, recent developments in neighboring Egypt and Tunisia have had limited economic impact on Libya so far, end of the quote. And the report also flattered Tripoli on a variety of fronts, saying that an ambitious program to privatize banks and develop the nascent financial sector is underway. Structural reforms in other areas have progressed. The passing in early 2010 of a number of far-reaching laws bodes well for fostering private sector development and for direct foreign investment. Executive directors of the IMF agreed with the trust of the staff appraisal. They welcomed Libya's strong macroeconomic performance and the progress on enhancing the role of private sector and supporting growth in non-oil economy. The fiscal and external balances remain in substantial surplus and are expected to strengthen further over the medium term. This is exactly what the report said just 1 week before the uprising started. Now, if you look at Syria briefly, we will see exactly the same process. In Syria, the Assad regime, Hafez Assad regime, the father of the current president, again decided to liberalize the economy in the mid-1980s, but he was much more cautious and many steps taken in a much more slower way. Liberal policies started in mid-1980s, and all this allowed the private sector to invest more freely, reduce price controls and subsidies in a number of sectors, and liberalize trade and exchange rates. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, 1989-1991, the Syrian economy became much more intertwined with the global economic structures. The conditions of state employees were deteriorating very rapidly as the private sector was emerging as the winner of this neoliberalization project. But all these were moving with much more slower pace in Syria until the Hafez Assad died and young Bashar Assad came to power. Since Bashar's accession to power in 2000, the state's reliance on the private sector grew substantially, and he signed a number of extensive agreements with the international financial institutions, IMF and the World Bank. Previously, economic liberalization was piecemeal, gradual, and largely in response to crises. Under Bashar al-Assad, there was a decisive turn towards the market economy. Domestically, this policy shift meant liberalization of prices for most commodities. Private banks were licensed for the first time, and a stock exchange was established. Deregulation of the real estate market allowed landlords to more easily evict tenants in previously rent-controlled housing, and laws protecting private property were strengthened. Liberalization and withdrawal of public support for the energy sector, as well as liberalization of prices of agricultural and industrial outputs accepted. Still, the extent of liberalization and rollback of the state in Syria was not as dramatic as its counterparts, such as in Egypt and Tunisia. However, those states were aspirations or models Syria was trying to emulate. In June 2005, during the 10th Regional Congress of the Ba'ath Party, the term social market economy was introduced as the new economic model for Syria. This signaled a decisive shift towards a more explicit neoliberal market economy. What emerged was an increasingly predatory neoliberal economy with a focus on consumption, unproductive investments, and the service sector. A kind of authoritarian neoliberalism. The neoliberal practices started to affect Syrian citizens' standard of living from 2005 onwards, much more seriously. And when we approach the end of the first decade of 21st century, the standards of living in many parts of Syria deteriorated significantly, already created a number of small uprisings in various parts. The concentration of wealth, on the other hand, has never been as uneven, where only 5% of the population owns more than 50% of the wealth. At the same time, the ruling class has been enacting an important but gradual transition from the planned economy to a neoliberal market economy that left more than 30% of the people unemployed and between 20 and 30% of the people living under the poverty line. This was according to UN calculations in 2006. No example illustrates the spirit of the era better than what happened just a few weeks after Bashar came to power in 2000. The young president ordered the removal of a massive picture of his father from one of the main squares of Damascus and its replacement with a Lipton tea advertisement of the same size. So the crumbling of the current regime and the current infighting in Syria, therefore, should be located in this long history of convergence between neoliberalism and the authoritarian control. So viewed against this background, the revolts in the Middle East and North Africa assume a much broader significance. They are not merely political responses for more democracy, but direct popular reactions to widespread economic misery, rising food prices, youth unemployment, and ineffective, corrupt local leadership. In this sense, the North African revolts are also a clear expression of people's rejection of neoliberal policies of the last 20 years. Thank you.